Before we begin with the panel, I'm just going to do some context, a little bit like where we are today in terms of housing and preservation in Los Angeles and what's ahead. And part of what's ahead is this is the launch, really the official launch of a new campaign for the Conservancy called Home. And it's our way of talking about, well, what is the nexus between preservation and housing and people and places, and what can we be doing and doing more to be helping in this arena? Because we all know we're all talking about housing from lots of different perspectives, and preservation needs to be at the table in terms of this issue. And so there's lots to do in terms of that, and other things will be coming in 2025. Soon we'll be releasing essentially a policy paper articulating kind of where we are on this issue, as well as a whole host of events and programs throughout 2025. So this is just the start in terms of what we're doing. And it really builds off of a study that we did in 2020 called Preservation Positive LA, and was the first study that we had done really looking at where does preservation intersect with lots of different issues, from economic development to housing to gentrification, displacement. And so this is really the next step in terms of this particular issue and what we want to be doing in terms of this. But again, being at a place like this really does illustrate how preservation can be contributing and adding and bringing more housing online. And I won't give a long background on where we are, but this is the 1926 YMCA, and it's a very interesting place in terms of it's always been about housing, just different types of housing. So from its first incarnation to what it served most recently to what it is today, it's about housing. And old buildings, historic buildings, are incredibly adaptable for new uses and certainly for housing in terms of that. But as we know, it's not always that easy. In terms of what we do. And what we're going to also talk about is adaptive reuse, and it's really, in many ways, the origin story of preservation, but that's also changed. So we're going to kind of dig in about, well, what's new with that and where are we going in terms of that. The other piece to what I want to talk about today is just putting some kind of perspective or context on housing more broadly, and how we arrived to where we are today and why it is a challenge. And it's not like it just happened overnight. I think most of you all know that. This is a cumulative things that have occurred over time to get us to where we are today. And just to articulate a few of those things that leads up to these kind of moments. And I'll just rattle off some of these, and I'm sure I'll miss some, just so that you know kind of where we start. So it starts from exclusionary land use practices, to redlining, to racial covenants, to policies and codes that are overly complicated and sometimes in conflict with one agency to another, that work in silos and don't always talk to one another. It's also to a reduction in new multifamily housing construction over time across the US and certainly in California, to a volatile real estate market, to state oversight increasingly over local planning and land use, to higher cost of construction and materials, to limited access to capital and high interest rates. And again, I'm sure there are many, many more things, but these are just a few of the challenges that we're all talking about when we're trying to deal with this. And it's just easier to just say it's very complicated when we talk about housing. It's not something you can easily solve, or you can solve it overnight in terms of what we do. And then to make it more complicated, there's a few things happening right now, and it's very timely in the city of LA. So next week, the adaptive reuse ordinance, what is being called 2.0, that is building off the 1999 landmark adaptive reuse ordinance, will go before City Council. At that very same hearing, the citywide housing incentive program, otherwise known as CHIP, will also go before City Council at the same meeting. So that should be lots of fun. In terms of that's talking about upzoning large swaths of Los Angeles up to 255,000 units and plus. And that's gonna have some implications on housing, but also people that are currently housed within multifamily. And so there's some pinpoints in terms of those issues and what we're looking at today. But with that in mind, I want to turn it over to the panel, and one again to say that this panel came together wanting to have lots of different perspectives and viewpoints, and realizing that when you talk about housing, it's not just one issue. It depends on if you're a tenant or a tenants' rights organization or a housing provider or a developer or an architect. You all have different points to play in this particular discussion. And even issues such as that we're often framing this, and it's often polarized in terms of saying, well, it's a YIMBY or a NIMBY. And when I say YIMBY, just so everyone knows, yes to my backyard, and NIMBY, not in my backyard, or no in my backyard. And I often think it's more of, a lot of us are more in the MIMBY, maybe in my backyard. If there's good design and planning and consideration of tenants and thinking about the future, about the way LA grows. So while I don't think we're all going to agree, I do think we have a lot more in common than in conflict. And I think that hopefully we'll see a little bit of that today. So let me start by introducing the panel and getting us going. So this is not in the order seated, so if you want to raise your hand when I call you. So let's start with Ryan, since he's, again, the reason we're here today. Alfari, Director of Acquisitions from the Hillcrest Company. And I also want to give a shout out to Ryan. He's also with an organization called Thrive LA, and thanks to them, they are underwriting the cost to film this so that we can share this more broadly than just you all in this space today. So thank you, Ryan, for helping us on that as well. We also have John Arnold, who is a partner with KFA Architecture. Karen Lilligren, principal and founder of Givning, and also a board member of the Los Angeles Conservancy. We have Edward Mendoza, who is a research associate of California YIMBY and also policy director of Livable Communities Initiatives. We have Charles Loveman, who is executive director of Heritage Housing Partners. We have Parisa Roshan, I say that wrong, hopefully I say it right, who is senior project manager at Thomas Saffron and Associates. We have Nicole Smith, with Clinton Manor Coalition. She's a member of this, so she's right in the trenches. And last but not least, we have Dr. Cynthia Strathman, Executive Director of SAGE Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. So as you see, we have a big group, lots of smart people, lots of thoughts in terms of this. And I'm going to start with the question and turn it over to Karen to talk about adaptive reuse since we're here, and how in 1999, LA became the national leader in advancing adaptive reuse and converting buildings for new uses, especially in downtown Los Angeles for housing and hotels that ultimately led to 12,000 new housing units. What's changed from where we were then to where we are today and the need for the 2.0 ordinance?
Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad so many of you went on the tour and you got to see this amazing project. We were so lucky to be the architects on this project. So adaptive reuse in 1999 when the city came out with the ordinance. The ordinance was really meant to help incentivize the historic core in downtown, which was pretty much completely empty, like literally empty, and to incentivize the redevelopment of those buildings into housing, because they were originally office buildings with banks or retail on the ground floor. So yes, highly successful. Also it was successful because it was the buildings were very inexpensive at that time. Construction costs and regulations were much less than they are today. It was a very specific type of building that was repeating, like the historic core was a specific area. And so they were all historic high rises, about the same height. They were usually like C-shaped or L-shaped. They had a lot of good light and ventilation. And also adaptive reuse at that time was really about urban revitalization. So it was about, revitalizing the whole kind of urban area. So the difference now, and just starting with that, is that the conversation these days is a lot more about adaptive reuse as a tool for sustainability, right? Reusing buildings, not tearing buildings down. Now we see how detrimental that is into our environment and embodied carbon in the buildings. It's also a conversation about cultural heritage or cultural identity, even if it's not necessarily a historic landmark. It could be a background building that was built in the 40s, or it's not historic, but it's old and it's really cool and it's part of the fabric of our city, right? So again, we don't want to tear all of those down. Some are going to have to come down eventually with densification, but not all of them. And then the third part of adaptive reuse these days is also the housing crisis, which is tied to very high office vacancy. So the city of LA right now, 60 million square feet of empty office space. So just think about how much, even if it's just a small portion of that could be converted to housing. So, but it's very difficult right now. There's little to no projects happening because, like I talked about before, costs are higher, land, prices have come down in buildings, but it hasn't come down enough. There's a lot of regulation, but there is a lot of things in the works, and one of the best things in the works is the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance 2.0, which is literally coming out in about 2 months. So it will not just be downtown and Hollywood and Koreatown, which is the current situation. It'll be the entire city of Los Angeles. There's also Pasadena is working on an ordinance. Santa Monica just implemented their ordinance. So there's a lot of policy reform. It's going to move the needle, but it's not going to catapult a whole bunch of housing. So we still need other things to happen. Yeah, so that's my summary.
Okay, so it's about 30% in terms that makes up for that 60 million square feet. Is that about right?
Downtown LA has a 30% vacancy,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And in context, I think San Francisco's 39%, and most cities are in the 20s, something like that. So immense amount of square footage is sitting vacant in terms of that. So we're going to come back to adaptive reuse, I think, throughout the conversation, but I just want to take a step back and talk more about housing strategies and priorities. It's a little bit long question, so bear with me, and then we will get with the full group in terms of this. But for some, when you're talking about housing, it's addressing the housing crisis. It begins with stemming the displacement of low-income renters. That's what some people are focused on. For others, it may be about streamlining production, and creating new housing through higher density development areas with nearby transit and high resource opportunities. Your approach to this will vary depending on your perspective, and I think that's probably true for this panel in terms of if you're setting policy or interpreting policy, if you're trying to put together a financing deal for a housing project, or if you are a tenants' rights perspective. Given all of this, for the full group, where do you think we have things in common, and where is common ground, and where do we have shared agreement in this big, messy, as I said before, complicated discussion around housing, just based on all your perspectives? So no easy question, but feel free, whoever wants to jump into that. No one does.
Wait, can you summarize
Just a simple, it's a simple question again. Where do we have common ground? Where do you think we have common ground, knowing that this is anything but simple in terms of different perspectives, approaches, priorities in terms of this? Looks like John wants to step in.
I'm going to say I think that there's flashpoints in single-family housing. I think we're not going to get agreement on that or even consensus. But I think in the city of Los Angeles, where we do have agreement is the commercial corridors, regardless of whether in the historic zones or not. Is like we have a lot of land in LA. We still have a lot of land. We've always had a lot of land. So I think there is agreement that if we can densify along commercial corridors and do it well, and especially with good design, good unit design. We've had lively conversations already this morning about what's leasable and what's not leasable. If we make it a good place to live for everybody, it doesn't have to be a single family home to be a good place to live. If we can focus on that, I think everyone would like that, including renters, including developers, including people who live in lower density neighborhoods, because more people means more services, means more restaurants, means more safety, means more infrastructure improvements from the city. So I think bringing more people into places where it makes sense aesthetically and densification-wise, I think that's where we have common ground.
With an asterisk.
Here it goes.
which is if you're chasing density, you start to, at some point, undermine the sense of community within where people live. So, do you add those last 2 or 3 units, or do you subtract those last 2 or 3 units in order to have a better, healthier project?
I would say more fundamentally, I think the agreement here, we should step back and just say, we need more housing supply. I think that may be the one central place where hopefully everyone on this panel agrees. Now the challenge becomes, at what cost? And you're gonna hear it through the panel, and I'm sure that's where we'll have all our differences, right? Because there's one pie, and everyone's trying to fight for their piece of the pie. But I think Los Angeles is not expanding in terms of land. That's not happening. So it's really gonna be a matter of, by definition, increasing density. And the question is, what style of housing do we want? Where do we want that housing? At what cost? Who's paying the price? And you're gonna hear a lot of different perspectives here, which I won't maybe start this question on, but I think where we need to come from a central agreement is that the fact of the matter is we need more housing, we need a higher supply, and we need it to be denser. So.
I would say, piggybacking on what Ryan is saying, yes, more housing supply. As a tenant, affordable housing supply is very important. But we were talking earlier, it has to be housing. I say affordable homing because as a tenant, in the heart of Los Angeles, I'm in Hollywood, I see a very difficult, if even non-existent pathway to home ownership. I feel like I'll be a lifetime renter. And as such, I want affordable homing, not affordable housing. I would like to see some units where people could actually live for long periods of time, maybe have a child, maybe 2, and actually live long-term in that neighborhood, because people aren't, it used to be, 10, 15 years ago, people would rent for several years and then be able to buy. I don't hear that from my tenant neighbors at all anymore. It's not a conversation we're having. So to have affordable homing, at least from my perspective, is a very important thing.
Okay, I think I have something in common, which I think is more of a general truth for Los Angeles. We have a lot of overcrowding in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a very different city today, or Southern California is a very different region today than it was like even in the 1990s or 1980s. In my neighborhood in South LA, it's characterized, you could drive by it, and it's a bunch of single family homes. And, you'd say, okay, I guess a bunch of single family or just families live here. But reality is that in these single family homes, you have 2, 3, 4, 5 families living in said homes. And you reckon with the fact that people are living in these conditions because they don't want to leave Los Angeles, and the economic opportunity and the security that you get from living in Los Angeles. A lot of people will say, you know what, I'll stay here with my daughter or my son, and I'll push for these, next couple years in order to make it, because I see a future in Los Angeles. I see that I have a job here in Los Angeles, and I can't see myself living in a state where maybe my rights are lessened. And that's, a very true thing that's going on in this country. And so that's something that we have to deal with and kind of reckon with. And I think that this panel has really good, ideas on how we could tackle this issue. And I look forward to hearing them.
Is it okay if I ask a question instead of okay?
Yeah, go for it.
So I love what you just shared, Eduardo, and I wanted to ask if you could help talk us through what it looks like in a neighborhood like what you're describing, where it's single-family homes, multi-generational, they have equity in their home, they don't want to leave, but they've outgrown it, right? It sounds like you're saying they've outgrown it. What would be the best way to add density and to add housing supply in neighborhoods like that are often so resistant to growth? And can you talk us through, where do you draw the line between adding supply versus gentrification, which I know that is probably another thing we all have in common. We're not so keen on that. So can you help me understand?
Sure. Well, someone who helped me understand was my grandpa in a conversation he had with me about 5, 6 years ago. he bought his house in 1965. He was a farm worker, and I guess in the 60s, if you save a good amount of money, you could buy property. And that piece of property has a duplex and an ADU. And growing up in that property, I saw my cousins, my uncles stopping by, staying a couple of years. I grew up in the property with my family. I shared a single family or a unit with 2 other families. We lived in the living room. And it was our house. It was a place where we lived, that's our generational home. And 5 years ago, my grandpa, tells me, he says, look, you see those people? I don't want to be fun, but there's, new people moving into the neighborhood. There's white people moving into the neighborhood. And he said, Eduardo, nobody likes bad land. If this was bad land, people wouldn't move here. Eduardo, we have good land. This is very, very precious land. And I don't know if you could do it today, but I would really like you to maybe one day build 1 or 2 more bedrooms here, 1 or 2 units, and always let your aunt, if she wants to stay in this house, because this is our family plot. And that conversation I've had with my grandpa, I've kind of seen reflected, with other friends of mine, of my background. And I see this need or this want for intergenerational living in the United States that I feel, could be lost. And, I think that'd be very tragic.
So there's a program right now that's about to start. It's very exciting. This man, Michael Anderson, a former architect, and he's been working on federal grants, and his goal is to take, it's called Accelerated Housing, and it is to promote multi-generational living and continued wealth for Black and brown communities, and specifically in South LA. And so the concept is exactly that, but you can understand that most grandmas or whatever that have the house and lucky enough to own the house don't have the wherewithal to figure out how to develop their property with a few more units. It's kind of a big deal, especially these days, everything's so complicated. So what's so wonderful about this program is that they are going to be assisting owners, literally we're gonna, he wants to move out grandma to an Airbnb for 9 months, and then when she comes back, she still has her house, it's upgraded. Now there's a small ADU that's connected to it. Maybe she moves into the GADU, maybe her kids live in the main house, and then there's a new duplex or something in the back. Maybe they rent that out for income, maybe that's the cousins, whatever it is. But I think the thing to note is that a standard owner is not going to have the wherewithal to do this on their own, even if they did have the capital. And of course, where do you get the capital for that? But it's wonderful also to hear that there are programs like this. We're excited to be a part of this.
So I go back to something Ryan said, that we all agree, increasing supply. If we all do agree about that, let's assume we do. And I know you did the little asterisk with John's comment about density, and that's something we're thinking about as well, is that, there's a lot of legacy businesses on those corridors that, how are they going to survive that densification? What do we need to be thinking about so we don't kill those kinds of livability factors as we're also trying to create density so we have those kind of neighborhoods we want to be in, so more complicated. Can I go to the question of if there is one thing that you could do in terms of to change something that would help to increase supply or its perceived barrier right now, what would that be? Knowing that there's lots of things probably that we want to change, but what is the one thing? And you all have different perspectives in terms of this, so I'd be curious where you are on that. Looks like Ed has a burning answer.
So I'm a planner that's my background. I worked for the city of Los Angeles for a couple of years. One thing that always comes to a shock to a lot of people is that for a very long time, and still even up till today, I want you to close your eyes and envision Pico or Beverly or whatever commercial thoroughfare in Los Angeles. And you see these commercial parcels, and they're usually, not super wide. They're, 30, 40 feet, whatever. What if I were to tell you that today there is no building code incentive and a planning incentive to build up on these properties? Nothing. What if I were to tell you that the current way to build on these properties, let's say a 35 square foot lot, is to buy adjacent lots next to each other? You can't do it with one. You have to do 4 or 5. And that process, you knock down whatever character that commercial strip had forever. I don't think that's it's a good way to get housing, but it's not a good way to keep the character of a commercial street. It's not a good way to be smart about it. We do like the mom and, the bakery. We do like this coffee shop. We do like the bodega or the grocery store that's been there for 30 years. How do we create the incentives and the policies to make it so the type of buildings that we build reflect these values? And so that's part of what I'm working on in my organization. We're focusing a lot on building codes, things that even planners would say like, it's not that important. As long as we get the units in, it'll solve itself in the future. And I think it's these crucial conversations that we have to have.
I think one hard conversation we need to have, and this is kind of an all-encompassing, thing from my position.
Why are you looking at me?
No, I'm speaking, Adrian, sorry. Is that we cannot continue to fall into this mentality that everything is precious. And I know that sounds callous, but if I name to you maybe 5 or 6 different aspects of development, I'll say environmental justice, right? So let's say we want to force it sounds like a great policy. We want to force every building to put a solar farm on their roof, every new building. That's great. It's going to help us get to carbon neutral. It's going to take, whatever. It's going to relieve pressure on the grid. There's 30 regulations like that. We want prevailing wage. Great. Yeah, of course, we want everyone to have a prevailing wage. We want 25% mandated affordable housing. Yeah, sure. That sounds great. Maybe 1 or 2 of these things on their own, are important. But if you add all these regulations, and then on top of that you say, every corner store is precious, and you say, we need whatever, all these different stuff together, there's really no incentive, there's really no feasibility left. And then what happens is the project doesn't get built. And then we're back at square one. And we have all these great ideas, but we're not ending up with the result that we need. I'll give you one example. You mentioned that CHIP is going to do 250,000 additional zoning, zoned units in the city of LA. Subtract all the historic buildings, subtract every parcel that has an affordable unit on it, because right now the city of LA basically regulates you out of being able to knock any of that down. Subtract all the parcels that are unbuildable because of, site conditions. Tell me how many actual units that you're able to build. That $250,000 number very, very quickly comes down to 50,000 units. And in the current economy, as often happens, it's not even feasible to build those 50,000. So, you're going to zone for 250,000 apartment units. How many units do you think the city of Los Angeles right now is zoned for? If you took by code all the zoning for all the parcels in the city of Los Angeles, and you subtracted all those categories that I just mentioned out, which is just a few that I just named on the top of my head, how many units can actually be built in the city of LA, even with current zoning? Forget about upzoning. In theory, you can build millions and millions of more housing units. But if you say every building needs to be an architectural marvel, add 50% to cost. If you say every building cannot displace one tenant, tenant displacement sucks. But if you have 2 units, a duplex on a 30,000 square foot lot that's rent controlled, and you're basically regulating it out of developability, right? Where I could have built 60, 70 units on that parcel. It's growing pains of a city. We're a huge metropolitan city that's built as a suburb. If we're gonna make a transformational change, we're gonna have to build up. There's gonna be growing pains, but you gotta look at it from a 10,000 foot view and definitely provide resources, right? Create regulation where it matters. But every single regulation, people always see it as a cost on the developer. And at the end of the day, developers are not gonna carry the cost. So it's not gonna be a cost on them, it's gonna be a cost on society. And we as a society really have to pick our darlings, as my English teacher once told me. Not everything can be precious. We have to choose the things that are really, really important, understand the cost, and make a decision affirmatively. Do we want this whole, recipe? You don't get to choose each individual agreement, right? It's a whole kind of system that we're creating. But outside of that, I think the one thing I would change is the way that building and safety is staffed, so we can get projects done really quicker. Takes on average 4 years to complete a development project in Los Angeles. In a place like Houston, which has no zoning and basically no regulation, it takes about 18 months. It's just food for thought.
So Ryan, do you want to summarize that? Because my answer is, to Adrian's question, what would we get rid of? For me, government overreach, government overregulation. I think right now, when you look at the statistics of 75,000 people living on the streets of LA County, 45,000 people on the streets of Los Angeles, it's a humanitarian crisis. And every good intention with all of our city officials and all the planning department and every inspector, all of these great ideas and intentions have a big dollar sign attached to them and a big schedule delay attached to them. And so if the goal is to house people and give them their dignity back as quickly as possible, we need to make decisions, as Ryan said, about what our priorities are. And I'm on the ground right now building in city and county of Los Angeles. Most of our portfolio, my portfolio is all affordable. Much of our portfolio is specifically homeless housing. And we are battling day in and day out with the city and the county to say, please expedite. Please accelerate. We are in a humanitarian crisis. Help us help you. And unfortunately, again, even with all the great intentions, they are constrained, they are understaffed, and so we end up waiting in the queue with so many of our fellow developers. And then people look at us and say, what's taking so long? And so I would say government overreach, government overregulation are primary drivers of the housing crisis that we're facing right now.
I think what I would add is that I would really like to, in some ways, I could change one thing, I'd change the questions we're asking and change some of the ways that we're looking at things. I'm not a developer. I work for a nonprofit that focuses really on trying to engage low-income communities of color in conversations about development because we feel that they're often left out. And I would really like to see their voices included a little bit more in decisions. And I hear everything that everybody said, you can't save every building or, it's important to save really nice looking buildings, all of these things. But a lot of these conversations historically have happened in Los Angeles without including a lot of the people who actually make the city work. And I think that it would be very, very important to help them. And on a more practical note, I would fully staff the housing department.
I don't know if this answers the question, but it's a response to what was already been said. I want to create precious. Bigger precious? We can still build precious. I think there's an attitude, especially among historic preservationists, old is good, new is bad. Black, solid line of that. And we can, if we're building in historic contexts, we can create things that are good. There's whole sections of Santa Monica and Pasadena that have been built recently that are pleasant, urban, new environments. And what it takes is, I'm going to be the architect now, is design. It takes sensitivity. And there's my favorite example to use is a building on Pico. It's up 9 stories tall. It is a box. It has no articulation on it. It's right next to an HPOZ. Right next, shadows a 1-story building at Pico and Norton. Built in 1926. It's a well-loved building, and all it has is a few cornices and some inset windows, and everyone loves it. And what a beautiful design is it? Well, from an architect's standpoint, it's a box with some classical design elements on it. We can recreate that and have a harmonious city that works. And I think specifically some of the rules that Eduardo was bringing up, you can't build townhouses like you see in New York, a 4-story townhouse, because of the fire department issues, separation issues. There's all these things that we can change in the building code. If you don't have an alley, forget it. You can't get to the back of your building. You're done in the city of Los Angeles. If we can change things like that, we can create maybe 3- and 4-story neighborhoods that are pleasant, that still, I'm not gonna push back too hard on Charles because he's a client of mine, and I want him to continue to like me. But I think that there are ways to say there is character, yes, but you can create character that's just as good, still matches, maybe a little bigger. I live in an HPOZ, and the pitchforks that come out when you talk about 6 stories, it's like you've kicked somebody. It's like you can't have 6 stories here in HPOZ. It's like you can, and you can make it work through design. So I want to create precious.
Can I just add one? Oh, sorry.
Well, I want to throw a curveball. So they say that where you stand depends on where you sit. So the organization that I run, Heritage Housing Partners, is a nonprofit affordable home ownership developer. We've been around since 1998, and with a couple of very small exceptions, all we do is low, moderate, middle, and market ownership housing. And just to add to that, it's mixed income. So we combine low, mod, middle, and market buyers all together in the same project. So my one wish is that as we increase supply, a huge chunk of that supply has to be affordable ownership housing. Some numbers, 2005, just about 20 years ago, in the state of California, we built 155,000 ownership units, single family, condo, townhome, whatever the configuration was, 155,000 ownership units. The last year for which I have statistics, 2022, we built 65,000 ownership units. So it's a 90,000 unit deficit times 20 years. That's 1.8 million units. And those were mostly starter homes. No, I mean, there were certainly people building luxury homes. So there was a huge component of that 155,000 unit production. There were starter homes. In California today, 35% of all renter households, there's I don't know, 35, I think there's 6 million renter households in the state of California. 35% of them make $100,000 a year or more. That's 2 million households who, in any other world before the Great Recession, would be ready for first-time ownership, buying a starter home. We still deliver that, but we're the only ones who do that, and we're the only ones who do it in a mixed income platform. So yes, my wish is we need to include ownership housing as part of the conversation for affordable housing so that all the folks that you live with that are like, we'll never be home buyers in California again, we got to get rid of that.
And I think just to add on to that, condominium laws in California are impossible. The risks are so huge. So what we're working on in AIA, American Institute of Architects, is to change the condo laws so the developers and the architects and the contractors aren't put at huge financial risk for building a condominium. And that will ease it up. And then the market will drive the preciousness and having quality housing because people will be buying them and they'll demand higher quality. They'll demand windows. They'll demand all the things that make a city good because they're buying them.
I want to come back to this issue, and we will, because I think it's a really important one in terms of that Charles brings up about, what kind of product are we providing now as a one-size-fits-all or one option versus the idea of what he's talking about is, how do you build generational wealth if you don't own anything going forward, or what Nicole's talking about or Ed's talking about, that's kind of missing from the equation when we talk about, housing solutions in the current kind of conversation. But I want to get back at the question in terms of like one thing you would change, and I'll put it on ourselves in terms of the preservation, heritage conservation field. And John kind of touched on it a little bit from his perspective, but I'd open it up to the rest of the group here. How would you like to see heritage conservation or preservation adapt? And I will say that I don't think we're all one size fits all, just like not all YIMBY groups are exactly the same. And I think we're pretty pragmatic about accepting that we do need to allow for greater density, and you can do density in historic neighborhoods if it's thoughtfully designed and approached. And we're also going there about, the really controversial issue about single-family land use. Should that be completely off the table, or should be there some thoughtful approach about how to do that in a way that doesn't cause impacts or unnecessary loss, especially to historic, single-family. But that's controversial in itself. But I'd be curious, where should we be adapting, you think?
If I can speak to this, I think the West LA VA campus is a great example of conservancy and adaptive reuse and conservation done well. So our team consists of Thomas Safran and Associates, Century Housing, US Vets. There's a couple of other developers there as well. And all together, we are part of a team developing housing in a community for our nation's homeless veterans. Some of you may know Los Angeles is the nation's capital of veteran homelessness. It is a moral stain on our city and county that we're actively trying to solve. We are, focused on about 70 acres of a 388-acre campus. There's about 25 projects. About half of them are adaptive reuse projects. So these buildings are beautiful Spanish Revival architecture from the 20s. After the 1971 Silmar earthquake, many of those buildings were vacated. And 50 years later, we have over 3,000 veterans still sleeping on our streets. And so our goal is to get that number from 3,000 to 0. Right now, there are 7 active construction projects at the West LA VA that will result in another 460 units. 196 of those are adaptive reuse units. So we're trying to take this gorgeous, precious architecture and put it to good use, serving our veterans and giving them the dignity and the housing that they've earned. And so I would say that's one place where, in collaboration with people like yourself, Adrian, and with the State Historic Preservation Office, it's working. They obviously have set guidelines, in terms of massing and the roof tiles and things like that, but they're reasonable and they're not slowing down our effort to build the housing that is so badly needed. So I would say it's a bright spot here in LA.
And if I could, I wanted to just jump in and go back to the conversation about housing as wealth building, which, at SAGE, we're not against it. We're like, no, people shouldn't have wealth. But I think at the same time, it does a little bit slip the question, I think, of what is housing primarily for, which is to house people. And we need to build homes with the understanding that they cannot be a pile of gold or a hotel room or, just a pied-à-terre for somebody. We really need to think about what we're going to do to build the housing that we need for people who need it. I don't think it's completely realistic to think that developers are going to build a lot of housing for people who have absolutely no money. I mean, except Charles, apparently. But like our constituents, there's somebody, as I was
What do you mean developers won't build housing for people who have no money? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that we aren't going to be able to solve the housing crisis solely with just for-profit market rate development.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree with you. But
Right.
like I said, most of our funding, most of our projects are either permanent supportive housing, meaning formerly homeless or at risk of homelessness, or low income.
Yeah. But so without wading into the details of that, and I'm not trying to undermine what you're doing at all, but I do think that we really need to kind of ask a question about what are we building housing for? If you're building, thousands and thousands of luxury units in downtown Los Angeles, is that going to be a way to solve the housing crisis? And is it reasonable to kind of expect that that kind of building will do that? And I think it's because we need to ask this question about, like, what is housing for and how are we really going to get to homes for people?
I'm actually happy you used the example of downtown. I used to serve on the Downtown LA Neighborhood Council. I was the head of planning. We approved, I think, 3 high-rises every month would come to our desk. We built, I think, 25% of the city's new housing stock on less than 5% of the city's land. Downtown LA is the only part of Los Angeles that during the entire run-up to, post-COVID, when rents were skyrocketing, downtown LA was the only area of Los Angeles where rents actually came down. And, you look at something like that and you say, okay, thousands and thousands of units we built, and still the rents in LA are not affordable. Yes, because even with those thousands and thousands of units that we built, we didn't even build 1% addition to the existing stock. The reason that people have been getting displaced since probably about 2010, which I think is when a lot of this mess started, there wasn't enough luxury housing being built. And because of that, this is just supply and demand. Because of that, a lot of the older buildings and a lot older neighborhoods, people started getting displaced because there wasn't enough housing stock. And so people were renovating these older buildings into luxury and jacking up rents. If we find a place for luxury, I think it trickles down as well, where all of a sudden the supply of lower income housing can remain lower income because we have more luxury supply.
Can we maybe noodle on that a little bit more about that issue? Because I think that's part of the frustration for a lot of folks out there is they mostly see market rate or luxury units being built, and they're like, okay, that's great. And it gets to this question, do we have a housing crisis? Do we have a housing affordability crisis? And if it's the affordability, why aren't we building more affordable? I understand that, we've talked about all the challenges about why that's not possible and what are the obstacles to that. But then do we see what you're talking about, the trickle down, which we've heard a lot, and I don't know if we see that actually making the impact of actually freeing up for affordability. So I would love to hear more about where should we be? I mean, it goes back to prioritizing. If we really are focusing on trying to create more affordable, is that where we should be creating? And then how do we provide the incentives of the financing to make that happen? And then I know I see some teeing up points, and that's perfect. But I also want to say, I forgot to mention earlier, but I think a lot of you have notes. If you have questions, in about 15, 20 minutes, we're going to get to audience. So I imagine you have questions. So feel free, put those on the list or a note, and we'll bring those up and be able to answer some of those questions too, because we want to hear your thoughts as well. But looks like Charles has a burning idea or thought.
Well, I mean, I think we have an affordable housing crisis and a housing crisis. I think from my perspective, what happened is that the Great Recession broke the housing market. There used to be more developers, there used to be more home builders, there used to be more units built. By the way, just going back to the statistics about housing production, in 2005, we built 53,000 multifamily units in the state of California. In 2022, we built 55,000. We should be building more. It should have grown, but it didn't go down. So what we're not building is ownership units. I'll leave it at that, but we need to, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
I want to add a little bit to your point. So before I was a planner, I was a demographer. Something happened in the 2008 financial crisis that was a bit of an extremely tragic coincidence. So not only did we stop building housing in 2008, and when you see building, and then nothing, right? At that exact same time, people my age, millennials, were aging, and we're getting nearer and nearer and nearer to the home buying state of our lives. What happened? The homes that were supposed to be built for us were never built. Yes. And so then what happened was this horrible negative feedback loop where all of a sudden we were pitted against older people, like Gen Xers and people from the boomer generation, and it became almost like a free-for-all of people who already had homes. I'm not giving up my home. I'm not even thinking about downsizing. That is out of the table. Gen Xers who said, well, I've been saving my whole life. I have to compete against this new generation coming up, and it just kind of cascaded into this horrible crisis that we kind of see today where, one thing that I want to point out is about 95%, which is massive, of our housing stock is unsubsidized. So it's private developers build it, and it rents for whatever it rents. One thing that I like to point out a lot is that this is really controversial, we do build market rate housing for low income people. And you're like, wait, what? Yeah, we do. In Los Angeles, we have something called a double duplex. And this is kind of like a mangling of the code, where you have essential buildings or homes with 10, 11, 12 bedrooms. Let me repeat it again. A home with 12 bedrooms. And you'll have 2 or 4 homes in a property. And all of a sudden, you have people that don't know each other, right? It could be entire families renting out bedrooms in a house, and that house has building code for a single family home. So this house doesn't have ADA access. If there's a fire, it's a type 5A or type 5B construction. So, God forbid there's a stove fire. God forbid, the sprinkler system goes off because they're using PCP piping. They're not using, They're not using copper.
There's no sprinklers.
There's no sprinklers in the first place. And so when you see that we're building a lot of these. Since 2017, there's been around 700 of these structures come up. And if I were to show you the building, you'd be like, oh yeah, I've probably seen them. You probably think they even look like townhomes to you. So when we have about almost, from 2017, it's almost a decade that we've been building this for working class people moving into Los Angeles. This is a horrifying policy failure. How is it? How is it that if you want to live, you move to Los Angeles and you make a living, you get a room and good luck? It's crazy.
Eduardo, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. It is a policy failure, but the policies don't really incentivize or encourage us to build something better. I'm a big proponent of middle-income housing, market rate housing for teachers, firefighters, nurses, ordinary men and women of LA. The incentives are not there. And so if we can find a policy solution that doesn't involve overregulation and government overreach, I would love that. We would love to build housing like that. It's just the incentives are not there. I was talking about this earlier. Right now, to be competitive for a lot of public financing programs, you have to be building, strictly homeless, all at risk of homelessness or formerly homeless individuals. And of course, you're even more competitive if you try to build that in a high resource area. It's very hard to find a property in the city of LA in a high resource area where the numbers pencil for us to build high quality housing for our disadvantaged friends and fellow Angelenos. So there's a real policy failure here. The incentives don't align, but hopefully we can find a solution, maybe not today, but hopefully this is the beginning of a bigger conversation about adjusting the policies so that we can build housing like that.
Parisa, I want to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, and I think what the panel is saying. There's two ways to create housing as far as I know it. One is market rate, and one is government housing. The cost to build an apartment unit, the average cost to build an apartment unit in the city of Los Angeles is approaching $600,000 per unit. And that's no profit, and maybe a portion of that is land, so you can say the market should dictate land price. Think about how much rent you have to charge with interest rates and with financial considerations to have to pencil a $600,000 apartment unit at the market rate level. Now you have public housing, which is the other kind of alternative, or subsidized housing. The program that I like to point to is HHH, okay? We taxed ourselves $1.2 billion with the goal of building 10,000 apartment units. I don't know what the numbers are right now, but I can't imagine it's much more than 1,000 apartments that were built. And the average cost of HHH projects are over $750,000. And that's for homeless housing. That is not high-rise housing, that's not luxury housing. $750,000 per unit. So what we're doing here is, as a city, we're trying to spend, throw a bunch of money to address really the lowest rung of the ladder, which is homeless and at-risk homeless people, which definitely we have to, it's a problem we have to solve. And because of regulation, we can only financially feasibly build for the top of the market. These guys are right. We're definitely have to fill the holes at the top of the market where people are paying maybe $3,000 rent, which is crazy.
But if I can talk about HHH for one moment, because Adrian and I were talking about this earlier. So are you all familiar with Measure HHH? Okay. So actually, we completed 59 units of I don't know how many. We completed 59 units. It's a building that's fully occupied, all reserved for formerly homeless veterans. And we were grateful for the opportunity to partner with the city of LA on that project at VA. However, the implementation of HHH was very difficult. The city, as I said, they are so resource constrained, they are so understaffed that even getting our draws funded on time was very difficult. And if any of you have worked in construction, you'll know that if you don't pay your GC, it's not going to come back the next day. And so again, it's another example of really good intentions. The program was designed with the best of intentions, but the implementation has fallen short. And the people who suffer as a result are Angelenos on the streets. And so finding a way to rethink our policies, help City of LA fill these vacant spots. I know so many people, including in the planning department, so many inspectors, they want to do good, but they haven't been able to fill these roles. And so helping the city find a way to fill these spots and help improve implementation and execution, I think we would all benefit from those outcomes.
Ryan, really quickly, there's a third way to build, to create housing. Take a high-income renter and move them into first-time ownership, and every time you do that, you leave a vacant rental unit behind. So those 90,000, that 90,000 per unit deficit in terms of ownership units, we would be able to create huge amounts of vacancies in the rental market, which would get filled, so creating a vacant rental unit is almost equivalent to building a new rental unit.
I'm kind of curious, your 600,000 a unit is an interesting statistic. Given that, is there, not a place then to really think about the rent control that exists in Los Angeles? Like, how much of that do we try and preserve? Because it is very expensive to pencil out a 600,000 a unit building. So I'm in the middle of, myself and the Clinton Manor Coalition, we live in a 54-unit courtyard Hollywood apartment, and we're in the middle of seeking a historical cultural monument nomination for our apartment building. We did it, kind of 8 tenants got together and just decided, committed to doing that, and maybe about a week before our hearing, thankfully our landlord sent us a letter saying that they're highly supporting it. So this is now an endeavor with tenants and the landlord to kind of facilitate this monument designation. Hopefully we get it. Our second hearing is on December 5th, so we have our fingers crossed it will continue to proceed. But our hope is, one, it can be kind of a historic reference because in its time, it was built 1939, 1940, it actually was the high density build of its time. It was trying to be a higher density than the bungalow apartments that they built around Paramount and Clune Studios because they needed exactly this. They needed workforce housing for the studio workers that was affordable. And I'm not saying, Ryan, that all historical buildings in Hollywood necessarily should precious. I'm the little precious versus the big precious, but I really like that idea. But I think what we're talking about, because there's so many perspectives, kind of reflects that there is MIMBY, but not MIMBY maybe, but MIMBY multi. There is some place for the small precious from a historical perspective, but it's not everything. Quite honestly, like our application, between the two, the initial one and the revision we did is over 300 pages. This is not something that, everybody is doing or it's so easy to do. It's very necessary. I absolutely advocate for it if people have a very special historically relevant building to put forward for the Office of Historical Resource. But I only say, I think there is a balancing act. I think there are, this is such a great example. You took a historical building, made it relevant, put affordable housing units inside of it. And apparently there are so many more in the city and the outlying areas to do so. I think we can continue to that. But I am just kind of curious, given how expensive it is, what do we say about the rent-controlled, affordable housing that exists? How do we maintain that? Do we need to maintain it? Does it pencil out that way? Because I don't have those statistics.
So I'll address it in 2 different parts. I think what you're talking about with historic preservation, I think hopefully most of us on this panel definitely agree with you, and I agree with you. This was a labor of love. This was not an easy project, but it's a crown jewel, and we're very happy to be a part of it, and it's part of a longer-term vision for what we love about LA and building out San Pedro and all that fun stuff. So definitely I agree with you. And the things that are worth preserving, we should definitely preserve, right? And so we've actually done a pretty good job on the state level and definitely on the federal level of providing enough carrots to try to incentivize preservation. There's definitely a lot of additional regulation and hurdles, and frankly, I think a lot of it's unfounded. And maybe there needs to be a review of a holistic approach to the way that we do preservation. I'll let maybe Karin and some other people talk about that more. But I want to address the second part of your question, which is more so relating to rent control. I think rent control is such a double-sided, it's a tricky issue. I think rent control, to the extent that it helps the incumbents, is, it's part of the fabric of LA. So we need protection for renters. I agree with you. Now the question becomes, to what extent do we take rent control? Because it's being pushed further and further and further to essentially taking away, any ability to, how do I say this? I guess deal with existing units to where we're disincentivizing future development. If we create a policy, which there was a huge, push for, to create vacancy control in California, that would stop all development dead in its tracks. And then all the other stuff that we're talking about, right, as part of this larger holistic approach, then we have a problem. And it goes back to this issue that I said of like everything, if we could have it all, it would be amazing. But everything comes at the expense of something. There's a societal cost to everything. And so we have to decide where in the spectrum do we want to be. I go to Houston, Texas a lot, not physically, but as an example, I go to Houston, Texas a lot, right? It's the opposite. Complete deregulation, anti-regulation place. In a place like Houston, where you can build, where there's no rent control, where, frankly, nefarious or bad intentioned tenants can be evicted when they don't pay rent, and it doesn't take 2 years and $100,000 to get somebody out, right? For having a skunk farm, true story, in an apartment. Yeah. In a place like that, skunk, multiple skunks, not one, as a pet. So in a place like Houston, right, where you take those issues kind of off the table. Listen, maybe Houston is not the most beautiful place. Maybe they're not the most environmentally friendly place. We have other priorities here in LA. I get that. And we have to contend with those things. But just as an extreme example, their rent to income ratio, and it's the third largest city in the country, their rent to income ratio is under 25%. Los Angeles is approaching 50% rent to income ratio. So we have a lot of ideals, but clearly we're doing something wrong. And I think rent control is part of the equation. I think there's a place for it. But I think that to kind of, go all in with our eyes closed is also a mistake. So that's what I see.
I would like to say a little bit, though, in defense of tenant protections, because, I think there are certainly tenants who are probably very bad actors. But because we see tenants coming into our tenant clinic, we see some landlords who are very bad actors. And we've had women come in whose landlords are basically extorting sex from them. And it's like, either you're going to sleep with me or you're going to be out on the street. We've had people report their tenants to Child Protective Services as a way to get them out of the unit. We've had people cut their water off. So, I just want, before we get too into pushing back on the tenant protections, I think it's important to really think about who they're protecting and how important those protections are.
I think it also goes back to the issue of balance, and certainly the way we're looking at this issue around housing is it's about how do we increase supply, but also how do we maintain the supply we have right now. And it's finding the sweet spot in terms of doing that. We're coming close to that magic hour, so if there's questions, I don't know, people are gathering on us, please bring them up. But I want to ask one last question before we open it up to the group, because I know this has been kind of doom and gloom in terms of challenges and the problems, and I want to switch it to a more positive outlook in terms of this. What gives you hope about housing the future in Los Angeles? And I will ask each of you, be succinct, but what gives you hope? What's some positive things that you're seeing? So maybe we start on this end with John first in this particular case.
Boy, what gives me hope? I'm all for all the state laws that are forcing the question. So that gives me hope that we will be able to produce things quicker, better, stronger, faster. Overlaid with that, what I really want is better, and I'm going to put on my architect's hat again, is better design guidelines. Not onerous ones, not things that say you have to chop off 2 floors because these are the objective standards, but smart design guidelines. And I see them, I work with Charles in Pasadena. Pasadena has smart, flexible design guidelines where they're willing to make discretionary decisions and create a city that's livable and beautiful and pretty high density when you go into old Pasadena. So I think that gives me hope that eventually that cities will be able to unshackle from regulation and just have smart planners, smart zoning codes, smart design guidelines, and that in turn will make it acceptable, like it was in the 20s, to have a single family house in an 8-story building right next door, because that's the way you did it. It was more for free-for-all. But I think that gives me hope that maybe we'll get to a better place to develop.
So I would say the thing that's giving me hope is that I think that people actually are starting to think a little bit outside the box about possibly different ways that we can build housing, different ways that we can supply housing to really, really low income people. And, you know, at Sage, I don't want to give the impression that we're sort of against luxury housing development. We're just saying it's not going to solve the problem for the people that we're seeing in our tenant clinics and that we're serving. So I think that that's one real bright spot, is that we're starting to think about like other ideas that we could add to the mix. And then another thing I think is giving me hope is that we are seeing a little bit more of a discussion about what the interventions on single family zoning need to be. And I know that that's probably a little bit more controversial, but I am actually sort of hopeful about that.
I will say what gives me hope is that so many of us still feel LA is worth fighting for. For my family, my grandparents and parents moved to America in 1979 in the early 80s, settled in LA, very much pursuing the American dream, and LA has become so out of reach for so many, so expensive. Our quality of life really has diminished from when I was a kid here. But as I look around the room and some people are shaking and nodding their heads, everybody in this room has very strong opinions, and everybody on the panel obviously has strongly held opinions. And the fact that we're all still so committed to fighting for our city to see a better, brighter tomorrow gives me a lot of hope. So hopefully we'll get there.
Well, this is tough. I mean, I guess from my perspective, being a planner, what gives me hope is that 10 years ago, we were still debating whether there was a housing crisis or not, and I feel like we've finally come to a consensus that yes, there is a housing crisis. Yes, there's an affordability crisis, and yes, we should tackle it. And seeing the motions of that has given me a lot of hope. Another thing that's given me a lot of hope is that we are working towards tenant protections that even though there are some setbacks, we are winning. Tahoe, or I don't want to go with acronyms, but we're not leaving, or we're struggling and fighting, and it's going to be a constant fight. But I think we're winning in not leaving the most vulnerable behind, and it's something that has to be constant, and that has to continually be in our mind, and something that could very much go hand in hand with growing beautiful cities and having new housing stock and keeping it affordable. I'm very hopeful, and I think we're going in a good direction.
I think what I'm hopeful about is kind of what you see on this panel here, everybody kind of sitting in different silos, but open to each other's ideas and really thinking of it as an information share. And to, kind of my personal instance, the fact that even though the tenants at Clinton Manor got together to push our historical cultural monument nomination, our landlord is behind us. We are working together. We're hoping that with that nomination and Mills Act's tax incentives, this will be a win-win for them too, that there's an opportunity in Los Angeles between tenants and landlords to help them find, everybody find a way where we can all live together, move forward together. It makes sense as a business for them, because I'm not sure if they had even thought necessarily about doing something like that, but because we brought this forward, all of a sudden they have this opportunity, and we're working together. So I'm hopeful there's a pathway forward. Again, it just takes a lot of conversations. I'm learning it's a big thing, and everybody actually kind of needs to be responsible. We are tenants that took responsibility on our own position as much as developers, architects, landlords, conservancies have done in theirs.
So in my business as a developer, we sit at tables with a lot of competing interests a lot. With planners, with building and safety, with architect, with engineers. And when you sit at a table and everyone's kind of there at the same time, everybody can really find a way that everybody's needs are addressed. Because if you don't, the project won't get built, right? And I really think that we're moving into an era, or we at least need to in the city of LA, and maybe even in a larger sense, larger than the city of LA, where everybody needs to sit at the table, and instead of going into silos, as you mentioned, and kind of everyone fighting for their own interests, we kind of come together and we say, okay, from a holistic standpoint, right? I think everybody kind of wants the same thing, right? Everybody has little interests here and there, but we all understand the problem, and I don't really think that it's, to anybody's detriment to get there, if we can get there in the right way. So as Adrian mentioned, I work with an organization called Thrive, and I've brought together, I've tried to bring together all these sort of competing interests and try to have conversations like this. And I think conversations like the one we're in now, it's a perfect example of, you can bring in the competing interests, and if everyone really understands what, you boil it down, what really are the necessities and what are the goals, I really don't think, LA is the center of a lot of the world. Something I'm hopeful about LA is, we have a great community and society here, and everybody wants to be here, and there's a reason for that. So I think if we come together, I think if instead of kind of having everyone go to war for their one issue, we can come up with a comprehensive, realistic solution to this crisis, I really do think we can get our heads together and get it done.
Okay, you literally said every single thing I was going to say. So I'll just save time, say ditto. But I really think that we in Los Angeles and California, we have a culture here that is so much more than other places about listening. And again, this panel is such a prime example of that. But you learn so much more when you listen, right? And then that's how you can find that compromise, because it's always going to be a compromise.
Thanks, Karen. Well, what makes me hopeful is that Vice President Harris, although the election didn't go her way, was intending to make the centerpiece of her housing strategy middle income first-time ownership. So that's actually given our program a little bit of legs. And the outcome of the election hopefully leads to what I'll call a collaborative disruption within the city of LA to look at the policies and practices that aren't working and fix them. Thanks.
Okay, we've got good questions. A couple questions are centered around adaptive reuse, and we haven't really gotten into the issue of downtown. We mentioned before, Karen mentioned 60 million square feet, 30% office vacancy rate downtown. This is a very specific question, but it's an interesting question. What building downtown, office building that is vacant right now, would you like to see adapted? Is there something in your sights?
Do we have 2 hours for me to go through all of them? Well,
what building isn't?
An example right now is the gas company tower, which the county just bought, and they want to make it offices. And I'm like, well, can't you make half of it workforce housing? And also, it's a good example of what could be an adaptive reuse, even though a lot of you might look at it and go, oh, it's a corporate tower. It's a really nice one, and also because it's a recent past building, it is mostly code compliant, so the cost and what you would need to do to convert at least half of the building to residential would be significantly less than if you took an old historic high-rise and tried to convert it.
Other buildings? Ed?
There's this building, I think it was like built either in the late 60s or in the 70s, the AT&T building downtown.
Crocker Bank building.
Yeah, that one. I think I've heard that it has a problem with adaptive reuse buildings. And please correct me if I'm wrong, is that sometimes they're too deep. So your units tend to be really, really narrow and you don't get that much sunlight.
And John and I will call baloney on that. There's always, if you're a good designer, there's always a way to make it work.
Well, this building has
This building has the opposite. Yeah.
On top of it, this building is a little bit more shallow, and so I've heard from my architect friends that it would be easier to develop on. The big factor though is the cost of making it code compliant.
Yeah, part of the issue that comes up a lot, or at least we hear, and each building its own unique animal in terms of floor plate sizes and the layouts and how conducive are they. And the other thing that we really didn't touch on, but the easy buildings that were readily adaptable for housing that happened through the 99 adaptive reuse ordinance, most of those they've been done. So it's now the harder buildings, and it's also a new class of buildings that were previously, excuse me. Keep filming.
The deep floor plate thing, just to take that a little bit farther, because it is something that I hear every single day. It drives me crazy. So there really are a lot of, there's a lot of, not every deep floor plate, and we're talking about like old office buildings, right? So you have the deep floor plate, It was after they had air conditioning and anyway. But you don't forget that floor to floors of the ceiling heights in old office buildings is significantly higher than in most residential. Usually the glass is not punched openings like you might see in most residential today. It's like floor to floor glass, right? So you're getting a lot more light into your unit. And then just very simple things that you can have your bedroom towards the back with borrowed light. So you can have a clear story or some glass to allow light in, so you do get circadian rhythms and you know when it's morning and when it's night and all that kind of stuff. There's also a lot of studies about, that when we sleep in darker and quieter spaces, not a closet in the back, but it's actually more healthy for our sleep. So there's a million reasons when we've got 60 million square feet of empty space that we can make it work.
If you want an example of a deep floor plate, there's a building we're working on 3 blocks from here. Beacon went through at 6th. Deep floor plates, and people work from home now. It's fine to have your office at the very back in a 5 by 5 space or 10 by 10 space. I like sleeping in a cave, so I'm fine with that. So yeah, and I think there's opportunities all over the place for all sorts of floor plates, and creative and successful.
Yeah, the bank building and also just the Crocker Bank building or AT&T Center that Ed had mentioned is right across the street from the Conservancy's office. So we look at that every day. Massive building that's sitting vacant among many. Yeah, we'll get on that.
I've already done plans for it.
Right, if we can figure that out, anybody can figure it out. We're at that magic hour, and I still have great questions here. So I'm going to throw out a few themes, and whoever wants to jump on them. But some are asking about, okay, what incentives do we need that's missing right now that could be like critical, could make the difference? And we've talked a little bit, and I talked on the side with some of you about that as well. So that's one. Others have raised the issue about, as we densify, what are the impacts on our tree canopy, our green space, access to, green space for people. That's a whole nother issue, which I don't think we're going to solve today in terms of that. And then last but not least, a whole nother issue is so much discretion from building inspectors, code folks, that, there's not predictability or consistency in terms of how things are being implemented or even interpreted, that makes this really hard. So if anybody, maybe we'll just take a minute or two. If anyone wants to chew on any of those 3 massive points, like I said, this is complicated, but those are some other things that certainly the audience members are asking about.
I'm happy to address, well, which one?
Whatever one you want to take.
I'll briefly touch on the first one. I think we're in such a state of crisis at this point that we can no longer rely upon the goodwill of others to solve this problem. And so allowing for there to be profit-driven incentives to developers and other people in this industry to build as much high-quality housing as possible is very important. And I think the more we take those incentives away, we can no longer ask ourselves, why isn't anybody building new housing? If we've taken away the incentives, then we can't ask that question anymore, and this crisis will worsen. So,
I just want to touch really quickly on Parks and Rec, because it's a passion of mine.
The TV show?
Yep, exactly. If we have time for that sidebar. I think that it's a perfect example of how the city tries to regulate itself out of a problem and put the onus on someone else. So if you're building a high-rise in downtown, or if you're building even a mid-rise in an urban area, why are we having the developer work on green space, right? The city has hundreds of millions of dollars in Parks and Rec fees that they charge developers. Where are the parks in downtown? If we're going to ask people to trust us to build a dense urban environment, where is the city coming in and creating, the green space, creating the parks, creating the livability, right? We're building the housing. Do we also have to build the green space? Do you want an additional 3 trees on an already squeezed lot? Is that really going to change the cityscape? Or do we need tree-lined streets and beautiful parks and dog runs and programming so that people can actually have livability in urban areas? That's my hope.
I write legislation for a living, and so I could give you a laundry list of things that we could adopt immediately. Things that are best practices either in other states or in other parts of the world that can significantly lower the cost of building housing. So one thing that I want everyone here to take away is, like, we have the solutions. We don't have to invent, it's not rocket, it really is not rocket science. But we do have to have the momentum, the grassroots support, the coalitions between groups and people here to say, hey, look, we're spending too much money in the United States, it's elevators. One elevator built in the same factory in Germany being sent to Switzerland, the same elevator will cost you $50,000 in Switzerland, which is not part of the EU, which is an extremely expensive country with extremely high wages, higher than the US. And in the US, the same elevator is going to cost you $250,000. And you say, why? Do we put in extra things, make it safer? No, it's the same exact elevator. It's just bad policy. Just the way we do it, it's just, it's just not done right. I could name 40 different things that we could do today that can make things more affordable. What will it take? People like us sitting together and say, we want to reduce hard costs here, we want to reduce hard costs here, and then getting it done. This is something we could get done fast. It's just a matter of doing it.
Well, we're going to wrap up on just a couple of points. If there's hopefully one thing that'll stick with you, because there's a lot of things we've covered today and a lot of things we didn't cover, and only some we touched on very briefly. But I think one thing when we're talking, we're preservation, but we're in this mix, and we have to be. But I think part of it is this idea that it's often equated as, well, you either get this or you get that, the either or. And I think we've got to put that aside. It's a both and. We can do this. And I think you're seeing that from all the folks here from different disciplines and focuses, that if we work together collaboratively, we can do this, but it requires a lot of collaboration, and that doesn't always happen. So that's part of our goal with our home campaign, is to be having more of these conversations, bringing people together, trying to tackle these tough, complicated issues and figure out where is that win-win, where it can achieve multiple goals in a way that we could be proud. I think, I'm not sure who said it, but we all do love LA. And I think that's the bottom line. It's a great city, but we want to ensure that it's going to be a great city in 15, 20, 30 years, and it could be a great city for lots of people, just not some people. The other aspect I will say, as part of our work, we're focusing really on three aspects that intersect with preservation and housing. One, we've talked about adaptive reuse. The other, we've kind of skirted around, but sort of, and certainly with Nicole, is a naturally occurring affordable housing or rent-stabilized housing, essentially existing affordable housing that we're increasingly seeing at risk. And the last piece, which John definitely talked about, infill development, and that is responding and in a positive way to existing contexts and neighborhoods and things that we're proud of that's getting built, because we're supportive of new as well. We need that, but in a way that reinforces what LA is. A lot of work ahead, a lot more conversations. Hopefully we can engage you all more in this and other people. So thank you for being here, but please thank our panelists for taking part in this.